In War Horse by Michael Morpurgo, a British farm horse is recruited into World War I, and we see the rest of the conflict unfold through his eyes. In this video, I will be doing a review of War Horse using a 5P system created by my friend Book Gabber on BookTok. My version of her 5Ps are purpose, plot, etc., prose, personal, and position. I give it a score for each of these categories and a final rating at the end, which is the average of all these scores. But before I do, I'd like to give this a vibes rating at first, and based entirely on vibes, War Horse is 3.5 out of 5. So let's start with purpose. Why did Michael Morpurgo write War Horse? He was inspired by stories he had heard from veterans of World War I, and his main takeaway was how much horses figured in those stories. This was the last really big war, or one of the last really big wars, in which horses were on the front lines, and the horses shared everything. They shared the service and they shared the suffering. The one thing that they did not share was the return home. That was a sad, I would say shameful chapter to the end of World War I, and it's one of the things Morpurgo documents in War Horse. In recent years, we've come to value marginalized voices, and we've made great strides in hearing out groups of people who normally do not get to tell their stories. But there is one group that really does not get to tell its stories, and that is the animal kingdom. It needs us to tell its stories for them. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. In War Horse, Michael Morpurgo does. He focuses on a very specific group of animals, the horses that served during World War I. And when all is said and done, War Horse is a war memorial, not a sculpture, not a beautiful statue of a horse in the middle of a historic square, but something with as much gravitas. As a memorial to the faithful service and valor of these animals, War Horse gets a purpose score of 5 out of 5. Now for plot, etc., in which I look at the big three literary elements of plot, character, and setting. Now, the plot of a historical novel set during wartime basically is just a diary. We're tracing what happened, sometimes closely, sometimes loosely. The characters may have agency, but it's agency that's very circumscribed. Before War Horse, I read Black Beauty, and one comment I made on the plotting of Black Beauty was that the title character didn't have much agency because he was a domesticated horse and he had to do what his owners wanted him to do. While the same thing can be said for Joey in War Horse, it can also be said for many of the human characters. They don't really have a choice. In the same way that the horses have to do what their owners and their handlers make them do, most of the characters here have to do what their commanding officers tell them to do. And the commanding officers have to do what those above them have ordered them to do. And that is the frustrating, often infuriating experience of wartime. But I do want to give Morpurgo credit for a chapter in which Joey has an unusual amount of freedom. He's entirely alone. He finds himself in the middle of what was called no man's land, the battlefield between trenches in which all the flora have been killed. The ground is desolate, smoking, strewn with barbed wire. It's no man's land, and for Joey, it's also no horse's land. What is he doing there? What is anyone doing there? And he is cold, hungry, wounded, in pain, terrified, confused, disoriented. He's all of these at once. And it is the emotional climax of an animal's experience in wartime. And I dare say, any living being's experience of wartime, which is why what happens next, which, not to spoil it too much, is reminiscent of the legendary Christmas football truce of 1914, is quite reassuring. Now, if you know the dates of World War One, you know that the Christmas truce was not the foreshadowing of the end of the war. It was kind of like the last civilized moment before it became what was later called the war to end all wars. Little did Europe know what would happen later on. But here, the resolution of this part of Joey's story is a foreshadowing of something better to come, a foreshadowing of the return of peace. And for this, the score specifically for plot is a 3.5. As for the characters, they are not really that fleshed out. Or if they are, we see them through Joey's eyes. And I would say that the characters who are the most three-dimensional are Albert, his human owner, and Albert's family and friends back in Britain. Once Joey begins his military career, everyone is a little more two-dimensional. When someone is a good guy, we see him at his best. And when someone is villainous, Joey gives a very superficial description of him, and we don't really get to see how he is villainous. Which I'm not criticizing, by the way. That's appropriate for a children's book, and frankly, I wouldn't want to see it even in an adult book. Sometimes the characters are only there to show us an experience of war. For example, Friedrich, one of the Germans who cares for Joey and his horse companion Topthorn, is someone who never wanted to be involved in the war and just wants to go back home to his family and to live the rest of his life out in peace. And his way of making sure he survives, and not just that, but making sure he doesn't do anything to result in the death of someone else, even if that person is one of the so-called enemy, he acts a little crazy. So the rest of the Germans think that he's a little nuts because he goes around talking to himself. He is perfectly happy to do the jobs no one else wants to do. But as Joey soon figures out, Friedrich is not crazy. He just wants to go home and he doesn't want to hurt anyone. And this is an experience of war for many people. And you'll notice that Friedrich is German. One of the best parts of War Horse is that Joey serves both the British troops and the German troops. He starts out as a British horse, and then when his rider is captured and becomes a prisoner of war, he is recruited to the German cause. I think that this was a wonderful choice for Morpurgo because it humanizes the other side, those we would consider the enemy. Joey even has a French experience, though not with French troops, but with French civilians. One of my wisest friends once told me that you know that a story is truly anti-war when the other side is depicted with as much humanity and individuality as the so-called good side, the side that you're supposed to identify with. And in this case, War Horse is 100% anti-war. I'd give it a character score, however, of just 3. Finally, the setting. World War I must have had some really dramatic settings. We don't really get that from the descriptions. All the descriptions are pretty bare bones. I couldn't really tell the difference between the farm that Jody grew up in in England and the veterinary hospital that he's taken to in France. They both have stables. And I did have to look up a lot of things just to get a visual on what I was supposed to be seeing. Even the chapter in No Man's Land, I think, could have been a little more evocative. For setting, I give this a 2. And when I add up those 3 scores and get the average, the final score for plot, etc., is a 2.4. Now for prose. My 3 words for describing the writing style are simple, journalistic, and restrained. As I said, when it came to the settings, the descriptions are very sparse. We might even compare them to wartime rations. You got what you needed to survive, but you didn't get a lot. And it left you wanting more. I must admit, though, that this style, especially the restraint, is what keeps it from being too traumatic. What I learned about World War I and about the horses in World War I after reading this was pretty harrowing. So I appreciate that it was written in a way that was appropriate for young readers. The parts of the writing that I liked the least were the speeches by the characters, especially if they were talking to the horses or about the horses, because sometimes they were blatant exposition, blatant commentary on how war makes no sense. And while I agree with them, I'm pretty anti-war myself, it was just too on the nose here. I also thought some things the character said were overly sentimental. I suppose you would be very sentimental at a time when people are dying, close family members, close friends. You just want to hold on to what you can and maybe idealize it a lot. I just tend to like my sentiment as something I can read between the lines instead of something that screams at me from the very lines themselves. For prose, I give Warhorse a 3. Now, my personal rating. I read Warhorse as part of my Year of the Horse reading challenge, in which I read books in which horses are significant in some way. Warhorse was also my follow-up to Black Beauty, and it felt like what I like to call a serendipitous sequel. Or maybe in this case, a serendipitous spin-off. Black Beauty gets to run the gamut of experiences that a Victorian horse would have, the one exception being going off to war. And we do get the war horse experience in Black Beauty because he is stabled with a former campaigner named Captain. Captain served in the Crimean War. When I finished Warhorse and reread Captain's story in Black Beauty, I was pretty shocked at how similar Captain's memories were to Joey's charge with the cavalry during the early part of the war when they were still sending out the cavalry, right before they learned that you shouldn't do that when the other side has machine guns. The machine guns changed everything, and Joey's experience went beyond anything Captain would have ever known. But there was still a logical progression from Black Beauty to Warhorse, which gave my reading challenge a sense of flow, which I like. I also was fascinated enough by what I read to do more research on World War I, not just the role of the horses, but World War I in general. However, I kind of wish there had been more in the novel itself and not from other reading or other study I had to do afterwards. I don't think that's really a fault of the novel because I think Morpurgo assumed his readers would have more of a foundation in historical knowledge than I did, and that they'd be able to follow the story better. I do think that if I had known more about World War One before starting, I would have also enjoyed this more. So Warhorse gets a personal score of 4. Now for position, which is always the most interesting one for me to score, and was my contribution to the 5P system because it was not in Gabriella's original model. Position looks at the place a book has in the literary canon and in the culture in general. What's interesting about Warhorse is that it grew in importance. When it first came out in 1982, it made modest sales and it failed to win a literary prize, which Morpurgo himself was a bit bitter about because the one judging the prize told him why he didn't win. Rub salt in his wounds, why don't you, Roald Dahl? And it was just a pretty solid contribution and a body of work that led to Morpurgo being one of the children's laureates in the 2000s. But what Warhorse's big break came when the National Theatre approached Morpurgo and said, "We want to do a production of Warhorse. We're interested in family-friendly material. We think Warhorse is going to be great." He gave his approval, and what they thought would be a play running for a season or two became so successful that it ran for years, not just in England, but in other countries. Most remarkably, also Germany. Morpurgo's big dream, when he realized what a success the play was to have a production in Germany because it would mark the 100-year anniversary of the start of the war. And there was a German version of the play produced called Gefährten. And this just really reflects how anti-war and pro-human he is. He wanted to bring this story to the other side because for him, they were not just the other side. It was also their story. It was a shared experience that should not have been as savage and brutal as it was. And his hope, as is the hope of everyone who is anti-war, is that if we produce literature and art and drama that is humanizing and that praises what is good in everyone, then maybe we can avoid so much widespread death and destruction again in the future. Another effect of the play being so successful was that an American who happened to be a Hollywood producer saw it, not really thinking much of it. She was in London, I think on vacation, and she wanted to do something that her daughter would be interested in. And she said, "Oh, look, here's a play with horses. My daughter loves horses." So they watched War Horse, and all she could think was, "We need to make a movie." And that producer was Kathleen Kennedy, and the person she called to direct the movie was Steven Spielberg. They made the War Horse movie, which made millions all over the world, which really made War Horse the bestseller that it is now. It was translated into 47 languages, not just because of the movie. I believe there were already translations before that, but thanks to the movie, there are now a total of 47 translations. And of course, people all over the world have seen the movie. It was nominated for multiple Oscars, although it did not win. Still, that's an achievement. And while I kind of wish that War Horse the book had done this on its own, I also appreciate that the story Morpurgo was telling needed a bigger canvas than what he was able to give it. It needed a louder trumpet than what he was able to blow. It is the acorn that grew into the oak trees that were the play and the movie, and that's pretty incredible. Everything I've heard about the War Horse movie, which I have not seen yet, is really good. Audiences loved it, critics loved it. I have not yet met anyone who has seen it And to be honest, I don't think it will ever end up on a list of anyone's top 10 war movies or even top 10 World War One movies, not because of a deficiency in quality, but because, and this is just my opinion, because it was told from the perspective of a horse, which we can't help. It's kind of built in. That might be a little unfair, but I get it. I'm just glad that we do have this horse's story out there. And eventually, someone who loves war movies is going to watch it and realize how beautiful it actually is. For position, I give War Horse a 4.5. And when we add all of War Horse's scores together, we get a final rating of 3.8, above average. Not bad. So what did you think? Have you read War Horse or watched the play or seen the movie? Did it inspire you to learn more about World War I or to learn more about horses? Do you just like it in and of itself? Do you think I should have rated it higher? All comments are welcome.